Welcome to Bed Crime Stories podcast. I'm your host, T. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, bed crimers. As always, I wish you the best. To anyone new here, a warm welcome. Thank you for checking out my channel. Let me just ask that after listening to or watching this video, if you learned something or enjoyed it, please do me a favor and smash that like button. Now, let's dig in. Chad Doerman, the 32-year-old father from Ohio, who's accused of doing in his 3 young sons, appeared in court on Friday for his arraignment. He pled not guilty to the charges. Doerman was indicted on 21 counts, including 9 counts of aggravated murder. Defendants, even when caught with a smoking weapon, usually plead not guilty, so that shouldn't come as a surprise. During the hearing, the prosecutor, Mark Tecalve, revealed some disturbing new details about the case. He stated that Chad Doerman planned the crime for months. He also revealed that 4-year-old Hunter was injured first inside the Doerman home. The second son injured was a 7-year-old who took off out of the house and ran some 300 feet from the residence and was then injured from behind, meeting his father, allegedly, shot him in the back. What a coward. Next, Doerman went after his 3-year-old son, who was in his mother's arms. Chad Doerman ripped the child away from her and then did that child in as well. The prosecutor asked that Chad Doerman be held without bond, and the defense attorneys did not argue. Thus, the judge granted the request. Doerman's next court date is July 5th at 11 a.m., and that will be his pre-trial hearing. The prosecutor said his goal is to have Chad Doerman face the death penalty for this brutal crime in which he used a Marlin model HC-22 rifle. Everyone is still asking the burning question, which is why? Why would a father do this, allegedly, to 3 little boys? In wanting to see if there was a pattern of violence in the Doerman home, WKRC News filed an open records request with Claremont County to see if there have been calls to the home in the past 3 years. Turns out the police were dispatched to the home 3 times since 2020, and one of those was last week for this horrendous crime. Doerman's record showed pretty much only traffic violations in Claremont County, aside from a criminal damage complaint when Chad was 18. And then there was a DV case 2 years later that showed that he choked his father. Both of those cases were dismissed. The father, I guess, dropped the charges. The Doerman's neighbor was interviewed by WKRC, and he said he allegedly saw Chad Doerman lose his temper with his kids. He said, quote, he tossed a couple of them around in the yard one day, end quote. I mean, the way he worded that sounds like horseplay, possibly. Then again, that could be slamming those kids into the ground. There were no records of child neglect or abuse. Then WKRC looked at, was there a pattern of financial problems? They searched the county auditor's website and found that the Doermans had purchased the converted manufactured home on 3 acres in 2016 for $75,000. And the Doermans were up to date with their taxes, which would seem to indicate no financial woes. The next thing they looked at was there evidence of mental illness. WKRC spoke to a woman named Diane Wright of Greater Cincinnati Behavioral Health Services, and she said, quote, the research shows at least those who have engaged in mass shootings have almost always had multiple issues that they were upset about and then a crisis they couldn't manage, end quote. WKRC then mentioned, this appears to be sociopathic behavior, yet in court we see real tears. We see him break down and cry, which doesn't seem to go along with that. And then Wright responded, and the key word you use is seams, and without doing formal assessment, without knowing someone better, we wouldn't be able to know, end quote. In addition, there are no documents that show police arrested Doerman or put him in a 72-hour psych hold prior to this incident. Why have so many of the cases lately been parents harming their children? I mean, this one, 3 little boys, ages 7 down to 3. Can you imagine the house now where it's just the mother with her older daughter and the silence, the absolute silence, because there's no more little boys running around making happy sounds. Until the next time on Bed Crime Stories, hey, do me a favor, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you next time.
Marcone is the court reporter today, and pursuant to Ohio Rules of Appellate Procedure 9A and B, the court is going to swear you in, Ms. Marcone. If you would please raise your right hand. I, Vicki L. Marcone, having been duly appointed as an official court reporter for the Common Police Court of Doerman County, Ohio, do solemnly swear and promise to uphold the Constitution and the laws of the United States of America and the Constitution and laws of the state of Ohio, and to faithfully and partially discharge the official duties of the court reporter. Would you please say that you will? I will. Thank you. Would you please sign? Thank you. So, for the record, for purposes of these proceedings, the court will order that Ms. Marcone will be the official transcriber of these proceedings without any further prior trial court approval. Mr. Haynes and Mr. Myers, you filed a motion to appoint lead counsel and co-counsel. You want to be heard on that before we get into the arraignment?
Yes, Your Honor. Thank you. We just submitted it along with an entry. Ms. Barron has signed that on behalf of the state. You know, we're both certified. I'm certified as co-counsel. Mr. Myers is certified as lead counsel. We've already talked with Mr. Doerman. He is indigent and eligible for public defender representation. If we'd ask the court to appoint us, I think it would be appropriate.
All right.
Thank you, Judge.
Here, so ordered. I've signed that entry. I'll instruct the clerk, and she knows this, to send a notice to the Supreme Court of this indictment, but I want to put that on the record. Also, Mr. Haynes and Mr. Myers, there's a form from the Supreme Court. It's called an appointment form of trial counsel. I think the PD or public defender prepares that. Do you know what I'm speaking of?
Yes, Your Honor. Mr. Haynes and I will take care of that after we're done on record today.
That's good.
We'll bring it to your staff, and I think it falls to the court then to forward that to the Ohio Supreme Court.
I think you're right. And then the court will send its own entry to the Supreme Court verifying that the clerk has sent a copy of the indictment to the Supreme Court. So I'll leave that record. All right. Does Mr. Doerman have a copy of the indictment?
Yes, Your Honor.
You've already provided that for him?
Yes, we went over it with him as Fate would have it in the jail last night. Due to certain security restrictions he's facing at this stage, he didn't physically have a copy, but we gave him one. We understand that jail staff also alerted him to the existence of the indictment shortly after it was filed.
All right. As to Mr. Doerman, Mr. Haynes, and Mr. Myers, is he eligible then for public defender?
He is, Your
All
Honor.
right. The court will sign that entry. Now, relative to arraignment, my preference is, and thank you, Ms. Doerman, for submitting to the court the possible penalties. I went over it. I think we also, hopefully, the defense got a copy of it.
We did.
All right. So what I'd like to do, and my preference would be, Ms. Allen, like the last couple of cases we've had, I'd love for you to go through each count independently. Put on the record what the state believes the possible penalties are. Then I'm going to turn to Mr. Myers and Mr. Haynes to see if they agree. And then I'm going to ask Mr. Doerman if he understands. And then we'll move to count 2, count 3, count 4, count 5, all the way through. Are you okay to do that?
Your Honor, may I address the court from the council table?
Yeah.
Thank you, Your Honor. And yes, I could absolutely do that for the court. I wasn't sure since counts 1 through 3 are all charged under 290301A, if you'd like to address them in group.
Individually. Yeah. Thank you.
Count 1, aggravated murder pursuant to Ohio Revised Code 290301A. There are multiple aggravating circumstances specifications attached to the underlying charge, including victim under 13 specification, course of conduct specification, felony murder specification, and firearm specification. The possible penalty, if convicted on the underlying charge of aggravated murder, as well as any of the aggravating circumstance specifications, is recommendation of death, life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The firearm specification carries with it 3 years mandatory, which must be served prior to and consecutive to any imposed prison sentence. There's also a possible fine of $25,000. If convicted of aggravated murder without any aggravating circumstance specification, the possible penalties would be life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. And again, the firearm specification would carry that 3 years mandatory, which must be served prior and consecutive to any post-prison sentence. Again, same fine.
All right. Does the defense agree with the recitation relative to count 1, Mr. Myers and Mr. Haynes?
We do, Jake.
And Mr. Doerman, do you understand that?
Yes, sir.
All right. Ask the count 2, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Count 2 is also charged pursuant to Ohio Revised Code Section 290301A, aggravated murder and unspecified felony. Again, there are multiple aggravating circumstances specifications attached to that charge. The victim under 13 specification, course of conduct specification, felony murder specification, and firearm specification. The possible penalties if convicted of the underlying crime of aggravated murder, as well as any of the aggravating circumstance specifications, would be death, life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The firearm specification, again, is 3 years mandatory, which must be served prior to and consecutive to any imposed prison sentence, and a possible fine of $25,000. If convicted of the underlying aggravated murder charge without any aggravating circumstance specification, the possible penalties are life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, and life with the possibility of parole after 20 years. Again, the firearm specification is that 3 years mandatory, as well as a $25,000 fine.
Thank you. Mr. Myers and Mr. Haynes?
We agree, Judge.
Okay. And Mr. Doerman, you understand?
Yes, sir.
Ask the count 3, Ms. Allen.
Thank you, Your Honor. Count 3 is also charged pursuant to Ohio Revised Code Section 290301A, aggravated murder, unspecified felony. It also carries with it multiple aggravating circumstance specifications, the victim under 13 specification, course of conduct specification, and felony murder specification, as well as that firearm specification. The possible penalties if convicted of the aggravated murder, as well as any of the aggravating circumstance specifications, would be death, life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. Again, the firearm specification carries with it that 3 years mandatory must be served prior to and consecutive to any post-prison sentence, and the $25,000 fine is possible. If convicted of the aggravated murder without any aggravating circumstance specification, the possible penalties would be life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, life with the possibility of parole after 25 years, life with the possibility of parole after 20 years, and again, the firearm specification is 3 years mandatory and same fine.
Thank you. As to count 3, does the defense agree with the possible penalties that have been recited?
Yes, Your Honor, we do.
For the record, Mr. Haynes, Mr. Doerman, do you understand?
Yes, Your Honor.
Thank you, Mr. Baron Allen. As to count 4, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Count 4 is charged pursuant to Ohio Revised Code, Section 290301B, again, aggravated murder and unspecified felony. There are multiple aggravating circumstance specifications attached to that count as well. The same aggravating circumstance specifications are victim under 13, course of conduct specification, and felony murder specification, as well as that firearm specification. Again, convicted of aggravated murder, as well as any of the aggravating circumstance specifications, the possible penalties would be death, life without parole, life with the possibility of parole after 30 years, or life with the possibility of parole after 25 years. The firearm specification again carries that 3 years mandatory, which must be served prior and consecutive to any imposed prison sentence, and the possible fine of $25,000. If convicted of aggravated murder without any aggravating circumstance specification, the possible penalty